budget GPU performance with a laser focus on esports titles and massive multiplayer games. You typically don't see that, but it's something that I wanted to change with this video, because you know how typical reviews and roundups go of GPUs, right? We test in a worst case scenario in order to have simple comparative testing between one GPU and another. But the games that we use in those reviews typically aren't the games that most people are playing. I mean, look at these stats. We're talking about games with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of concurrent players. CS2, DOTA, PUBG, Apex, and this doesn't even include player counts from games that are played across multiple clients, like Rainbow Six, or outside Steam altogether, like Fortnite, Valorant, and a few others. And look, I know a lot of these titles can be played on mid-tier GPUs that are several generations old, even on integrated graphics, but actually getting the game to run is different from playing it well, because in these situations, players are looking for every competitive edge they can find. So image quality typically takes a backseat to maximizing frame rates. Even then, hitting the holy grail of 120 frames per second or more becomes challenging with lower end GPUs from a few years ago. And what if you're tired of making those image quality sacrifices? You absolutely want a constant 120 frames per second, and you're looking to upgrade your GPU to something that's currently available on the market. What are your options? How do they compare against one another? That's what we wanted to find out here. So we took 10 modern GPUs from the NVIDIA and AMD 70 series all the way down to the entry-level B570 and RTX 5050. I'm also adding the most popular mid-tier card on Steam right now, the RTX 3060, as a baseline for this comparison. Those will be put to the test in 11 of today's most popular multiplayer games at 1080p and 1440p. But we didn't stop there, because look, there are some expectations that people have when they buy a new GPU. Even though many of these are more budget-focused cards, people still hope they'll achieve at least 100 frames per second, even at 1440p if they choose to buy a new monitor. I mean, buying a new GPU needs to feel like an upgrade. So that was our target for settings, a comfortable 120 FPS at 1440p, with 144 being a stretch goal. I also wanted to take a bit more realistic approach to the CPU being used here, so we tested with a 9600X. And if you're wondering, since we're using mid-tier to entry-level graphics cards, no, the system wasn't CPU limited in most situations. And we've actually proven that, right? Because we did a massive roundup going through many previous generations of mid-tier CPUs with the RTX 5060 Ti and RX 9060 XT. And believe it or not, all of them almost held up so well to mid-tier GPUs. You can actually find that right up here, and you really need to take a look at that after watching this video if you are looking for an upgrade for an existing system. But you know what you should also be looking at? This case from Thermaltake.
In the vastness of nature, every color tells a story. Matcha green, the color of renewal and fresh beginnings. I mean, take a hint. Hydrangea blue, the hue of tranquility and quiet reflections on how easy it is to work in. Snow white, the essence of purity and crisp air, and having all the hair after the assembly. And black, the depth of mystery shadows, but no mystery to hardware compatibility. This isn't just a stunning ITX enclosure, it's a vibe to shape your mood. The TR100 by Thermaltake. Check it out below.
Anyways, I also wanted to set a little bit of a baseline here from a pricing perspective, because when it comes to these value-oriented GPUs, anybody buying into this category is excessively price conscious. They want to maximize their bang for buck quotient. Unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, the market right now is working for and against you in that regard. So once again, let's take the RTX 3060 as a baseline. It was launched for $330 in the US more than 4 years ago, and ironically came with more memory than many of today's 5060 and RX 9060 series cards. And these days, at least on the NVIDIA side, you'll need to pay a hell of a lot more to get over 12 gigs of memory. But otherwise, the vast majority of GPUs we're looking at here go for less than 400 bucks, at least based on MSRP. And if we look at current retail prices, the 8GB versions of the 5060 Ti and 9060 XT are in pretty low demand, obviously, and have seen their prices cut by about 30 bucks. On the other hand, AMD's 16GB version is still dealing with a $20 price increase over their starting at price. So I guess the next stop is benchmarks, and I think I'm pretty happy where we are here with the GPUs we included, because we cast a pretty wide net here when it came to pricing. We went all the way from the B570 up to the 70 series cards from AMD and NVIDIA, and I think that sort of perspective is a very important one, because a lot of people want to know if you're in the market for a 60 series card, is making the jump up to that 70 series card, which is, yes, more expensive, really worth the premium? And for those who are new to our charts, we're using a butterfly format with 1080p results on the left and 1440 on the right. Current generation NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel GPUs are laid out in a stacked order, with the RTX 3060 sitting right at the bottom. So let's start with Apex Legends, and I should mention straight from the jump, this game has a hard FPS limit of 300. The RTX 5070 and RX 9070 smash face first right into that at both resolutions, with both the RTX 5060 Ti's doing the exact same thing at 1080p. But in general, what you'll see here are very good performance increases over the 3060 right across the board, with the only exceptions being the 5050 and B570. And speaking of those Intel GPUs, given their prices, they actually do pretty well in this game at both resolutions. CS2 is a little more complicated though. All of the NVIDIA cards except the 5050 again give consistently high averages and 1% lows, providing a great upgrade path for users with older GPUs. There are also some minor benefits in going with the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti over the 8GB version. Yes, even in this relatively light game. But the Radeon cards, unfortunately, they're all over the frickin' place, with the two 9060 XTs getting just trampled to the point where they're barely able to stay ahead of the 5050 at 1080p and actually lose to it at 1440p while struggling to stay ahead of the two ARC cards. That's a huge contrast to the 9070, which stays very competitive at both resolutions. Helldivers 2 represents yet another challenge for those mid-tier AMD cards. While they're doing, I guess, relatively well against the B580 and 570, even the vanilla RTX 5060 manages to stay comfortably ahead. We're also seeing another instance where 16GB GPUs make a positive impact at both resolutions, and in this game at least, the 5060 Ti would provide RTX 3060 owners the most logical upgrade path with an almost 65% performance increase. Luckily for AMD, that trend of low frame rates doesn't continue in Marvel Rivals. All of the Radeons are getting excellent performance right across the board, either matching or beating 60 series NVIDIA cards that are generally more expensive. Sadly, the Intel cards simply don't have the horsepower to keep up here, or their potential is simply being locked behind a lack of driver optimizations. But we're right back to the 9060 XT series chronic underperformance in PUBG, where they're essentially tied with the ARC B series again, and the RX 9070 represents a literal quantum leap forwards in performance. And it really is sad to see many of the strengths that we saw from the RX 9060 XT in our standard gaming testing simply aren't translating over to some of the most played games on the planet. At least in this game, NVIDIA cards become a no-brainer. Battlefield 6 also shows the two 9060 XTs essentially tied or a bit behind the regular RTX 5060. But don't think it's all doom and gloom for AMD here, guys. That's actually a good result for the 8GB version, since its price is a solid $30 lower than the NVIDIA card. Unfortunately, it is terrible news for the 9060 XT 16GB, which is a good $20 more expensive than the RTX 5060 Ti 8GB these days, and that card outperforms it by a pretty good margin at both resolutions. The Intel ARC B series, on the other hand, chronically underperforms at 1080p against the RTX 5050 of all things, but their larger memory footprints seem to be beneficial at higher resolutions. Another trend that's happening over and over again is the clear superiority of the 70 series cards, even at 1080p, and at 1440p they're on a whole other planet. Then again, they're in a whole other price category too. Rocket League, meanwhile, shows sort of like a yin and yang situation for AMD. Their frame rates just fall off a virtual cliff at 1440p, going from beating the 5060 at lower resolutions to getting destroyed by the 5060 when the resolution increases. Another interesting thing is this is one of the few games where 16 and 8GB cards seem to run on a completely level playing field, with minor clock speed variances likely being the only real differentiating factor here. AMD's position also holds strong in Rainbow Six, with especially good 1% lows. And speaking of those, it's an area where 8GB NVIDIA cards just get wrecked at 1440p. I mean, the 10 gig ARC B570's 99th percentile frame rates are almost able to match those from a technically much more capable RTX 5060 Ti 8 gig. Honestly, if there was ever proof that you should simply avoid 8GB cards when there's a version available with more VRAM, well, this is it. And this also highlights one of the B500 series strengths. While they aren't meant to compete directly against AMD's and Nvidia's 60 series, they provide an excellent alternative to the RTX 5050. But I'm not actually sure that's a compliment, because in a lot of situations, that card is an absolute dog. Warzone, on the other hand, is another title where AMD is ultra competitive, and their models end up either matching or at 1440p dominating RTX 5000 series cards that are more expensive. But then again, we know Radeon GPUs have always been strong in this title. Nvidia still gives adequate performance, except that 5050 again. It just gets dominated by the $20 more expensive RX 9060 XT 8 gig. Intel also needs a mention here because the B series does give good overall performance, but their 1% lows suffer a lot. So the gameplay experience they provide actually feels a lot worse than the RTX 5050. I also want to focus a bit on the upgrade story here, because the RTX 3060 might be more than 4 years old, but in many situations, it still delivers an adequate gaming experience, especially at 1080p. Here it easily hits over 120 frames per second and is still perfectly playable at 1440p. And yet the newer GPUs in the same $300 to $400 price range can give some massive uplifts. Take the 9060 XT 16 gig for example. It's about 70% faster at 1080p and 83% when using a higher resolution. The RTX 5060 Ti 16 gig on the other hand gives similar frame rate boosts, though not quite as much. And would I recommend saving that money and buying one of those 8 gig cards? Again, absolutely not. I mean, sure, they're competitive at 1080p, but in Fortnite and some other titles, they start falling pretty far behind their 16 gig siblings at 1440p, and that really constrains monitor upgrades in the future. Anyways, Valorant is a pretty Nvidia friendly title here, and that's actually a common thread we've seen throughout testing. Yes, AMD cards generally do well and come out ahead in some situations, but it feels like the GeForce driver stack is more finely tuned for these multiplayer and eSports titles, especially on their 60 series cards. But that 5050, yep, I'd avoid it altogether, since at its current price level, there are a ton of used options out there, like the RTX 4060 Ti or RX 7600 XT. Technically, I could say the same about the ARC B series, but their larger memory footprints are sometimes pretty beneficial, like here where they match the RX 9060 series and pull ahead of the RTX 5050 at 1440p. Nonetheless, even with maxed out settings, DOTA 2 is an incredibly easy game to run, with even the RTX 3060 having no issues whatsoever pushing out more than 200 frames per second, while the 1% lows seem capped by the game engine rather than any one system component. Another thing that stood out, and unfortunately for the wrong reason, was AMD's RX 9060 XT's lack of consistency, I guess you would call it. Look, these things performed very well in the vast majority of cases, but there were 4 key games where performance just fell off a cliff. CS2, Valorant, PUBG, Helldivers 2. Not sure what's going on there, but it really did sour my overall experience with those GPUs. And in the end, those 4 titles contributed to both 9060 XTs losing to the vanilla RTX 5060 8 gig when all the games were averaged out. And I can't tell you enough how disappointing that is, because it makes the RTX 5060 Ti 16 gig look like a much more versatile option, even though it costs a whole $60 more. It doesn't struggle with consistency like the 9060 XTs do, especially at 1440p. But speaking of 1440p, if you're dead set on using a higher resolution monitor, the RTX 5070 and RX 9070 both offer a titanic frame rate uplift over every other card here, but much higher prices too. They're certainly not what anyone would call a budget-friendly option. But if we focus solely on each GPU's ability to deliver maximum bang for buck in esports and multiplayer titles, that's where things start to get interesting. Because if we go by the starting at prices given by AMD and Nvidia, the RTX 5060 is hands down the winner here, proving once again that you absolutely don't get better value with higher end GPUs. You just get exponentially higher prices alongside those increased frame rates, which is why entry-level cards like the 5050 and B series look so damn good here. They deliver substantially lower frame rates, but their cut down prices completely balance that out. And yet, if we shift to a bit more realistic perspective, showing the average starting prices at retailers at the time of this video is being made on October the 20th, while the 8GB versions of the 9060 XT and 5060 Ti got a cut of about $30, which makes them look a whole lot better. Meanwhile, the 9060 XT 8GB has got a super aggressive price right now of $270, and that makes it technically the best overall value right now, but I just can't recommend it because its standing varied so much from one game to another. Also, the 16GB version's overall price increase in retail channels causes its FPS per dollar ratio to just plummet, becoming one of the worst here. And yes, the 8GB versus 16GB discussion absolutely needs to happen again, because I'm sure by this point in the video, the comment thread down below is already full of people saying that we're making these 8GB cards look a lot better than they really are. And I agree with you, but you have to take into context the games that we're using here are easier to run titles where you're less likely to get into any memory bottlenecks. On the other hand, there were some situations even here where we saw the 16GB cards being clearly superior. And those 8GB cards, they are absolutely going to show their age a lot quicker than anything with more VRAM. And because of that, I would say, and also because of AMD's lack of consistency here, that the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, if you can afford it, is the best GPU to have in this range right now, specifically for esports and these multiplayer titles. On the other hand, if you're just looking at pure bang for buck, the RTX 5060 8GB is very, very hard to overlook. But you also have to take into perspective that that card, along with the RTX 5050, RX 9060 XT 8GB, and the ARC B series, comes to this area where buying a used card is probably going to be your best bet. So anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I'm hoping that you enjoyed this video. Have a great day, guys.